Judge sentenced an outlaw. Then his daughter stood up as the outlaw's wife. Judge Samuel Morrison thought he held justice in his hands, until he sentenced a man to 15 years, and his own daughter stood up as the outlaw's wife. The gavel felt heavier than usual in Judge Samuel Morrison's weathered hands that morning. Perhaps it was the weight of the man standing before his bench, Jacob Black J. Carmichael, whose name had been whispered in fear across 3 counties for the better part of 2 years. Or maybe it was the way the desert heat pressed against the courthouse windows like the breath of something hungry, something waiting. Morrison had built his reputation on the foundation of unwavering justice. For 23 years, he had sat behind this oak bench, watching desperate men and broken women parade through his courtroom like ghosts seeking absolution. He had learned to read faces the way other men read newspapers. Every line of guilt, every shadow of defiance, every flicker of hope that maybe, just maybe, mercy might find its way into the proceedings. But Jacob Carmichael's face was different. It carried no plea for sympathy, no performance of remorse. The man stood with his hands shackled behind his back, shoulders squared against whatever fate awaited him. His dark hair hung loose around a face marked by sun and hardship, and his eyes, steel-gray eyes that seemed to hold depths Morrison couldn't fathom, never left the judge's own. The charges read like a litany of sins: cattle rustling, armed robbery, assault with intent to harm, and murder. The murder of Thomas Henley, foreman of the Double Cross Ranch, found face down in the dust with a bullet in his back. The evidence was clear enough to hang a man, but something in Morrison's gut had stayed his hand from the ultimate sentence. Perhaps it was the way Carmichael had surrendered without a fight when the sheriff found him. Perhaps it was the haunted quality in those gray eyes. The courtroom was packed tighter than Sunday service. Ranchers sat shoulder to shoulder with townspeople, all hungry for the spectacle of justice served hot and final. Morrison could smell their anticipation, leather and sweat, and the metallic tang of bloodlust barely contained. In the front row, Thomas Henley's widow clutched a black handkerchief, her face a mask of grief demanding retribution. Morrison cleared his throat, and the murmur of voices died like wind before a storm. Jacob Carmichael, he began, his voice carrying the authority that had sentenced men to prison, to exile, to the gallows. You have been found guilty by a jury of your peers on all charges brought against you. The evidence has painted a clear picture of a man who chose the outlaw's path, who took what wasn't his, who brought violence to peaceful communities. He paused, feeling the weight of every eye in the room. Somewhere in the back, a baby cried briefly before being hushed. The floorboards creaked as someone shifted their weight. Even the flies seemed to have stilled their buzzing. However, Morrison continued, "This court has seen fit to show mercy where the law allows. You will serve 15 years hard labor at the territorial prison. 15 years to think about the choices that brought you to this moment. 15 years to your honor." The voice cut through his words like a blade through silk. A woman's voice, clear and steady, carrying something that made Morrison's blood turn to ice water in his veins. He looked up from his papers to see a figure rising from the gallery's shadows, a young woman with sun-darkened skin and calloused hands, wearing a simple brown dress that had seen better days. But it was her face that stopped his heart. "Your Honor," she repeated, stepping into the aisle between the packed benches. "He's my husband." The courtroom erupted. Voices rose like startled birds, chairs scraped against wood, and someone's boot heel struck the floor with a sharp crack. But Morrison heard none of it. The world had narrowed to that face, older now, marked by hardship and sun, but unmistakably, impossibly, his daughter Catherine. His Catherine, who had vanished 3 years ago into the vast emptiness of the territory, leaving behind only a note about finding her own path. His Catherine, who had grown up in this very courthouse, playing between the pews while he dispensed justice, who had once believed her father could solve any problem with wisdom and fairness. His Catherine, standing proud and unashamed, claiming marriage to the man he had just sentenced to 15 years of hell. The gavel slipped from his numb fingers and struck the bench with a sound like thunder. In the chaos that followed, Morrison found himself staring into those steel-gray eyes of Jakob Carmichael. And for the first time, he saw something there he had missed before. Something that looked almost like love. The dust motes dancing in the courthouse air seemed to mock him, spinning like tiny worlds knocked from their orbits. 23 years of justice, 23 years of knowing right from wrong with absolute certainty. And now this. His own flesh and blood standing as witness to how completely he had failed to understand the most important case of his life. As the bailiff called for order and the crowd slowly settled back in a stunned silence, Morrison felt the foundations of everything he believed crack like sun-baked earth. The question hanging in the air wasn't about Jakob Carmichael anymore. It was about a father who had lost his daughter so completely that she had chosen to build a life in the shadow of a man the law called irredeemable. How long had she been sitting there, watching him condemn the man she called husband? A judge's daughter vanished into the wilderness 3 years ago, but when she returned, she carried the child of the outlaw he'd just condemned. The silence that followed Catherine's declaration stretched like a hell breath. Judge Morrison watched his daughter, his little girl who had once braided wildflowers while he studied law books, place her hand protectively over the swell of her belly. The gesture was so natural, so maternal, that it hit him like a physical blow. She was carrying a child, his grandchild, the child of the man he had just condemned. Catherine. Her name escaped his lips like a prayer, like a curse. 23 years of courtroom composure crumbled as he looked at the woman his daughter had become. Her hands bore the calluses of hard work. Her skin held the deep tan of someone who lived under the open sky. And her eyes, his wife's eyes, carried a strength he had never seen there before. The bailiff stepped forward, unsure of his role in this unfolding drama. The crowd remained frozen between shock and fascination. But Catherine moved with the calm dignity of someone who had walked through fire and emerged with her soul intact. 3 years, Morrison whispered, his voice barely carrying across the courtroom. 3 years, Catherine, and not a word. Not a letter. I thought. He stopped himself, remembering where they were, remembering the audience that hung on every word. You thought I was dead. She finished for him, her voice steady. Maybe that would have been easier for you, Papa. Easier than knowing your daughter chose love over law. The word Papa struck the courtroom like lightning. Murmurs rippled through the gallery as the pieces fell into place. The judge's daughter. The missing Morrison girl. The scandal that had quietly burned through the territory's polite society 3 years ago when Samuel Morrison's only child had simply vanished like smoke. Morrison felt the weight of every stare, every whispered conversation that would follow this moment for the rest of his days. But beneath the professional humiliation, a deeper pain cut through him, the agony of a father who had lost his child not to death, but to his own failures. How? The question came out cracked and broken. How did this happen? Catherine's eyes found Jacob's across the courtroom. Even shackled and condemned, the man straightened under her gaze, and Morrison saw something pass between them. A communication deeper than words, forged in hardship and sealed with devotion. I found him dying by Willow Creek, Catherine said, turning back to face her father. Shot in the shoulder, burning with fever, more dead than alive. I was camping there on my way to Santa Fe, trying to find work, trying to find myself after. She paused, and Morrison knew she was remembering their last fight, the harsh words about duty and proper behavior that had driven her from his house. You saved him, Morrison said, understanding flooding through him like cold water. I saved him, and he saved me. Catherine's hand moved again to her belly. He was gentle, Papa. Gentle in ways I had never known a man could be. He told me stories while I cleaned his wounds. He made me laugh for the first time since Mama died. He never asked me to be anything other than what I was. Morrison remembered his wife's laughter, how it had filled their house before consumption took her 5 years ago. He remembered how the silence that followed had driven a wedge between father and daughter, how his grief had turned him cold and distant, how his devotion to justice had become a wall between him and the one person he should have protected above all others. "The crime's Catherine," he said, his voice heavy with the weight of evidence and testimony. "Thomas Henley was trying to force himself on Maria Santos," Catherine interrupted, her voice sharp as a blade. "Jacob was passing through, heard her screaming. He tried to stop it peacefully, Papa, but Henley drew his gun first." The courtroom erupted again, but quieter this time, as if the story had drained some of the bloodlust from the air. Morrison looked at Jacob Carmichael with new eyes, trying to reconcile the man he had just sentenced with the person his daughter described. "The cattle," Morrison asked, "belonged to corrupt ranchers who were letting families starve while they shipped beef to Denver for higher prices. Jacob gave the meat to people who hadn't eaten in weeks. Children, Papa. Children with hollow eyes and swollen bellies." Morrison felt something crack inside his chest. Not break, crack like ice beginning to thaw. He had built his reputation on the certainty that law and justice were the same thing, that right and wrong were as clear as black ink on white paper. But standing before him was proof that sometimes the law failed, sometimes justice wore the face of an outlaw, and sometimes a father's rigid righteousness could drive away the person he loved most. "Why didn't you come home?" The question came out raw, stripped of judicial authority. "Why didn't you tell me?" Catherine's composure finally wavered, and for a moment, Morrison saw the little girl she had once been. "Because I knew you would never understand. Because your law books don't have room for gray areas, and Jacob lives in the spaces between black and white. Because I was afraid you would choose justice over your daughter." The words hung between them like a bridge spanning an impossible canyon. Around them, the courtroom had become a theater of human drama more compelling than any dime novel. But Morrison saw only his daughter's face, saw the woman she had become in his absence, saw the life she had built with a man society had branded irredeemable. "I chose wrong," he said quietly, the admission falling from his lips like tears he had forgotten how to shed. Catherine's eyes softened, and Morrison saw forgiveness flickering there like candlelight. But before either of them could speak again, Jacob Carmichael's voice cut through the moment. "Judge Morrison," the outlaw said, his words carrying the weight of a man who had nothing left to lose. "I need to tell you about the night your daughter saved my life. I need to tell you why she's the finest person I've ever known. And I need to tell you why I'd rather hang than let her think for one moment that loving me was a mistake." The courthouse settled into absolute stillness, as if the building itself was holding its breath. Outside, the desert wind scratched at the windows like time itself, demanding to be let in. What truths would emerge when an outlaw spoke of love, and a father finally listened with his heart instead of his gavel? In his private chambers, Judge Morrison faced the man he'd condemned and discovered that justice had been wearing the wrong face all along. The private chambers behind the courtroom had always been Morrison's sanctuary. Here, between leather-bound law books and the faded daguerreotype of his late wife, he had wrestled with difficult decisions and emerged with the clarity that had defined his career. But as he led Catherine and the shackled Jacob Carmichael through the heavy oak door, the familiar space felt foreign, charged with tensions that no legal precedent could resolve. The afternoon sun slanted through barred windows, painting golden stripes across the worn Persian rug his wife had chosen 20 years ago. Catherine settled into the chair across from his desk, her hands folded over the life growing within her. Jacob remained standing despite his chains, his gray eyes taking in the room where his fate had been sealed. Morrison poured 3 glasses of water from the pitcher on his sideboard, his hands trembling slightly as he offered one to his daughter. She accepted it with a small nod, and he saw in her face the ghost of the child who had once brought him wildflowers picked from the courthouse yard. "Sit, Mr. Carmichael," Morrison said, gesturing to the remaining chair. "Speak your piece." Jacob's chains clinked softly as he settled into the chair, but he didn't touch the water Morrison offered. Instead, he looked directly into the judge's eyes with an intensity that made Morrison's practiced composure waver. "Judge Morrison," Jacob began, his voice low and steady, "I want to tell you about the night your daughter found me. I was dying, not just from a bullet wound, but from something deeper, I lost my way so completely I couldn't remember who I'd been before the hunger and the desperation changed me. Morrison listened, his legal mind cataloging details while his father's heart struggled with the reality that this man had touched his daughter's life in ways he never could. I had a family once, Jacob continued. A wife named Sarah, a boy named Tommy. They died of the fever 3 winters back, along with most of the folks in our settlement. The territorial government promised supplies, medicine, help that never came. I buried my son with my own hands, Judge. Buried him in ground so hard I had to use dynamite to break it. The words hit Morrison like physical blows. He glanced at Catherine and saw tears tracking silently down her cheeks, though her face remained composed. After that, Jacob said, I stopped believing in laws made by men who never went hungry, never watched their children waste away while bureaucrats shuffled papers and made promises they had no intention to keep. I took what people needed to survive. Yes, I stole cattle, but every head went to feed families who would have died otherwise. Morrison set down his own untouched water glass. And Thomas Henley? Jacob's jaw tightened. I was passing through the Santos spread, looking for work, when I heard the screaming. Maria Santos, barely 16, fighting for her virtue against a man twice her size. Henley had a reputation for taking what he wanted from the Mexican families. Everyone knew, but who was going to stop the foreman of the biggest ranch in the county? So you stopped him, Morrison said. I tried to talk him down, told him to walk away, that whatever he thought he was owed wasn't worth destroying that girl's life. But Henley was drunk on power and whiskey. He drew on me, Judge. Said he'd claim I was rustling cattle, that no one would believe the word of a drifter against a respected foreman. Morrison found himself leaning forward, caught in the story despite himself. What happened then? I was faster, Jacob said simply. But I never meant for him to die. I aimed for his gun hand, but he was stumbling, and the bullet caught him wrong. By the time I realized how bad it was, he was gone. The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of truth and consequence. Morrison looked at his daughter, seeing in her face the woman who had chosen to love a man carrying such burden. You could have run, Morrison said to Jacob. After Catherine nursed you back to health, you could have disappeared into Mexico. I thought about it, Jacob admitted. But running would have meant leaving her. And Judge, your daughter saved more than my life. She saved my soul. She reminded me that there was still good in the world, still reasons to hope. Catherine spoke for the first time since entering the chambers. He asked me to marry him the night I told him I was carrying his child. Not because he felt obligated, Papa, but because he said he'd found his way back to being the man he was before grief broke him. Morrison studied Jacob's face, searching for deception and finding none. You surrendered willingly when Sheriff Hayes found you. I did, Jacob nodded, because Catherine deserves a man who faces his consequences, not one who runs from them. Because our child deserves a father who chooses courage over cowardice, even when courage means accepting punishment for the choices that led him to love. The word struck Morrison like a physical blow. Here was a man who had committed crimes, yes, but who had also displayed a moral courage that Morrison wasn't certain he possessed himself. How many times had he chosen the safety of legal precedent over the messy complexity of human truth? You understand, Morrison said slowly, that my sentencing you to 15 years means your child will grow up without a father. Understand, Jacob replied, his voice thick with emotion. But I also understand that your daughter deserves a father who loves her enough to see past his own pride and prejudice. The accusation hung in the air like smoke. Morrison felt the full weight of his failures as a parent, his rigid adherence to law over love, his inability to see that justice sometimes required mercy to be complete. She ran from me, Morrison said quietly, more to himself than to either of them. My own daughter ran from me because I made her feel like my courtroom was more important than her heart. She didn't run from you, Papa, Catherine said softly. She ran toward something she couldn't find at home, toward acceptance, toward understanding, toward a love that didn't come with conditions and judgments. Morrison rose from his chair and walked to the barred window, looking out at the town he had served for more than 2 decades. The sun was beginning to set, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple that reminded him of the sunsets he and Catherine used to watch from their front porch when she was small. "What would you have me do?" he asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "Love her," Jakob said simply. "Love her the way she deserves to be loved. Love her enough to let her make her own choices, even when those choices challenge everything you believe about right and wrong." Morrison turned back to face them, seeing not a criminal and his victim, but a family that had been torn apart by circumstances, choices, and the harsh realities of frontier life. He saw his daughter's love for this broken man, saw the life they were trying to build together, saw the grandchild he might never know if he chose law over forgiveness. The gavel that had felt so heavy that morning now seemed like a feather compared to the weight of choosing between justice and mercy, between upholding his reputation and embracing his daughter's happiness. Could a man who had spent his life dispensing judgment finally learn the difference between punishment and redemption? After 30 years of wielding justice like a sword, Judge Morrison discovered that mercy could be the sharpest blade of all, one that cuts through hatred to heal what seemed forever broken. Dawn broke over the courthouse like a promise 3 days later, painting the adobe walls in shades of gold and hope. Judge Samuel Morrison sat alone in his chambers, the black robes of his office folded neatly on the desk beside his resignation letter. Today would mark his final session as a territorial judge, and the weight of that knowledge felt different than he had expected. Not like an ending, but like a door opening onto something he had never dared to imagine. The courtroom filled slowly as words spread through the territory. News traveled fast in the desert, carried on wind and whisper, and everyone knew that Judge Morrison had called for an emergency session to reconsider the Carmichael case. Ranchers sat beside shopkeepers, Mexican families crowded in next to German settlers, and in the front row, Thomas Henley's widow clutched her black handkerchief with white knuckles. Catherine entered quietly, her condition more apparent now in the simple blue dress Morrison recognized as her mother's. She had spent the past 3 days at her childhood home, sleeping in her old room, while father and daughter slowly, carefully began to rebuild what had been broken between them. Jakob walked beside her, still shackled, but somehow different, straighter, calmer, like a man who had made peace with whatever fate awaited him. Morrison took his place behind the bench one final time, feeling the familiar weight of the gavel in his hand. But today, the wood felt warm rather than cold, alive with possibility rather than rigid with precedent. "This court is called to session," he began, his voice carrying clearly to every corner of the packed room. "We gather today to address the matter of Jakob Carmichael, who was sentenced 3 days ago to 15 years hard labor for crimes against the people of this territory." A murmur ran through the crowd like water over stones. Morrison waited for silence, then continued. "In my 23 years on this bench, I have believed that justice was a simple thing, that right and wrong were as clear as the letters in a law book, that punishment was the only path to righteousness. I have been wrong." The murmur grew louder, confused and expectant. Morrison looked at Catherine, drawing strength from the quiet pride in her eyes. "Mr. Carmichael," Morrison said, addressing Jakob directly, "you have committed crimes against the property and persons of citizens in this territory. The law demands punishment, and I will not dismiss that demand. However, this court has also heard testimony about the circumstances that led to your actions, about the failures of government and society that pushed desperate men to desperate measures." Jakob met his gaze steadily, neither hope nor fear flickering in those gray eyes. "Therefore," Morrison continued, "this court hereby amends your sentence. You will serve your time not in territorial prison, but in service to this community. You will spend the next 5 years helping to rebuild the homes and lives affected by the drought and fever that have plagued our territory. You will work alongside the families you once stole from, proving through your labor that redemption is possible." The courtroom exploded in voices, some angry, some amazed, all confused by this unprecedented turn. Morrison raised his hand for silence, but his attention was focused entirely on his daughter's face, watching tears of joy and relief track down her cheeks. Furthermore, Morrison said, his voice growing stronger, "Mr. Carmichael will remain in this county under supervision of this court, with the understanding that any violation of this trust will result in the full reinstatement of his original sentence. He will support his growing family through honest labor and prove that a man can be more than the worst thing he has ever done." Jakob Carmichael stood slowly, the chains around his wrists seeming suddenly fragile. "Your Honor," he said, his voice thick with emotion, "I accept these terms. I swear before this court and before God that I will spend every day of my sentence proving worthy of the mercy you've shown me." Morrison nodded, then looked out over the crowd. "To those who question this decision, I say this: justice without mercy is not justice at all. It is vengeance wearing the mask of law. Today, this court chooses to believe that even broken men can be mended, that love can triumph over hatred, and that sometimes the highest form of justice is giving someone the chance to prove they are more than their mistakes." From the back of the courtroom, an old Mexican woman began to clap, slowly, deliberately. Morrison recognized her as Maria Santos's grandmother, the woman whose family Jakob had tried to protect. One by one, others joined her, until the applause filled the courthouse like rain on thirsty earth. Not everyone clapped. Thomas Henley's widow remained seated, her face a mask of pain and anger. But even she seemed to understand that something larger than individual vengeance was at work in that room, something that spoke to the possibility of healing rather than endless retribution. Sheriff Hayes stepped forward to unlock Jacob's chains, the metal falling away like shed skin. Jakob immediately went to Catherine, taking her hands in his calloused palms and kissing her forehead with a tenderness that made even the hardest hearts in the room soften slightly. "Papa," Catherine whispered as the crowd began to disperse, using the childhood name that Morrison thought he would never hear again. "Thank you." Morrison removed his black robes for the final time, folding them with hands that no longer trembled with the weight of absolute authority. "No, daughter. Thank you. Thank you for showing me that there are more important things than being right." As the courthouse emptied and the afternoon sun slanted through the windows, 3 people remained in the space where justice had been transformed by mercy. Jakob knelt beside Catherine's chair, his ear pressed to the swell of her belly, listening for the heartbeat of their child. Morrison watched them with eyes that saw clearly for the first time in years, understanding finally that love was not weakness but the strongest force he had ever encountered. Outside, the desert wind carried the scent of rain, rare and precious in this harsh land, but real nonetheless. Change was coming to the territory, carried on the backs of people willing to believe that tomorrow could be different from yesterday, that mercy could water the seeds of justice in ways that punishment never could. Jakob looked up from his wife's belly, meeting Morrison's eyes across the fading light. "Judge," he said quietly, "what do we do now?" Morrison smiled, feeling younger than he had in decades. "Now," he said, "we go home. We build something better than what came before. We show our grandchild that even broken families can heal when love is stronger than pride." As the 3 of them walked out of the courthouse together, grandfather, daughter, and son-in-law united by the recognition that mercy was not the opposite of justice, but its truest expression, the sun set behind them, painting the sky in shades of forgiveness. The gavel remained on the bench, silent now, its work finally complete.